time of great excitement around our home. Our kids kind of go up to the Christmas tree around this time and kind of look at us and think, so are all the presents under the tree? You're not like missing anyone. And so it's always a time of celebration and of excitement. And I know for many of us, we can become familiar with the Christmas story. I mean, you read the Christmas story this time of year, and perhaps you go to concerts or you go to pageants. And last week was a great celebration for us here. Just a chance to be reminded of just God's goodness in all of life. And we had some of our younger ones up here, again, retelling us the Christmas story. And there's always a bit of flashback sometimes for me, right? Because you see the kids up there and you're reminded of the story. And I think of the times when I was a little younger and I would be up on stage. And you have different characters that perhaps you like in the Christmas story. You know, some people like kind of to be Mary or Joseph. I was talking to one young woman just this yesterday, and she was saying, you know what, I got to be Mary once. I got to be Mary once in all the pageants. And she thought that was pretty good, and she probably should have been given more opportunities. But anyways, I always like to be one of the shepherds. I just love being the shepherds because, you didn't really have that much to say. I know, shocking, me not wanting to talk. I got over that in later years in life. But I love to be the shepherd because you kind of hang out in the background and you got to bring your hockey stick to church. And as a 7-year-old, how cool is that? And if there was someone kind of bugging you, you'd give them a little shot and whatnot. But it was always great. But there's always, I think, one character in the Christmas story that maybe gets a little bit of a bad rap. That for the last 2,000 years, often is looked at in perhaps not the most favorable of lights. And that's all because of one line, one sentence in the Bible. One sentence that we read here this morning. When Luke is recounting a part of the Christmas story, he says, and then Mary had a baby, wrapped him in cloths, and then laid him in a manger. Because there was no room for them in the inn. And there it is, the innkeeper, the infamous innkeeper, who for whatever reason, we often jump to the conclusion and think, here is a young couple knocking on their door, looking for a place to stay, and the innkeeper is like, I got nothing for you. I got some animals and a stable, more of like a cutout into the rock. You can kind of hang out there. And we look at this story, and we can think, really? Is that the best that you could have done? But I want to suggest here this morning that perhaps we need to cut the innkeeper just a little bit of slack. He potentially was incredibly busy, perhaps incredibly overworked. You see, historically, this would have been an incredibly busy time for all the people within the Roman Empire. Because as we read, the government had issued a decree that everyone had to return to their home village from where they were from in order to register with the government. The government probably wanted to make sure that, everyone was paying their taxes. Yes, I know, shocking, it still happens here today. But they also wanted to make sure how many people did they have in case they went into battle. And they wanted to see how many people were registered within the Roman Empire. And so Bethlehem, which would have been a bit of a sleepy town on the outskirts of the big city of Jerusalem, suddenly was bursting at the seams. And there wouldn't have been a lot of places to stay. There's no hotels.com. You couldn't register and make reservations in advance. And so people would be coming and knocking and frantically looking for a place to stay. And maybe this innkeeper was just overwhelmed. And so as we read the story, as we look at the innkeeper, the question I ask is, why did we include that detail in the Bible? I mean, why didn't Luke just simply say, you know what, and Mary had Jesus in the manger, and just leave it at that? There clearly was a reason. And what I start to notice when I read the Bible is to look for these subtle inclusions that perhaps can be so easily overlooked, and use them as an opportunity to perhaps reflect a little bit more in terms of what that begins to mean in our life. how can this passage begin to take root in our lives as well? I think there's two primary ways you can read the Bible. You can read the Bible for information. You can come to the Bible and you can learn the details. You can get all the information you want. But oftentimes when we land in that camp, it doesn't begin to make a difference in our life. You know, we can read this story and we can say, okay, yeah, there was no room in the inn, and on to the next part. You know, when do the wise men show up, right? And we just gather all the information, but then we begin to live our lives in the very same way. But if we begin to read the Bible not simply for information, but transformation, suddenly it begins to impact our lives. Suddenly we begin to ask the question, not why did the innkeeper not make room for Mary and Joseph? We start to ask the question, where am I in the story? Where am I in the story? If you're relatively new to Christianity, or you're still kind of checking out Jesus, you know, I would really suggest that when you read the Bible, when you open the Bible, don't simply read it for information, but begin to see yourself in the story. Begin to see where you may land in the midst of it. Because when you start to do, it starts to change and impact and influence all of life. You start to see how the Christmas story continues to ring home and be true in our lives as well. And so what if this morning, instead of piling on the innkeeper, instead of wondering why there was no room for him, we begin to place ourselves in that spot and begin to ask ourselves the question, how do we respond when God knocks on the door of our lives? How do we respond? There's a great passage in the book of Revelation, the very last book of the Bible. In Revelation chapter 3, there's these letters, there's these messages that are going out to the early church. And in one of these letters to a group of people living in a city called Laodicea, Jesus, at the very end of it, he offers these words. He says, listen, I stand at the door and I knock. Whoever hears my voice and welcomes me in, I will come in and eat with them, and they will eat with me. You see, what we begin to see in the Christmas story, in the reality of Jesus, is that it's not just simply information for us to digest, but it's an invitation to begin to live life with God. And in the midst of life, we see that there's times, there's different ways that God often knocks upon the doors of our lives. Sometimes it's really obvious. You know, I mean, you look at the Christmas story, it was incredibly obvious for the shepherds. Right? I mean, let's cut the innkeeper a little bit of slack. He got a little knock on his door. And he was overworked, he was busy, he was overwhelmed, and he just kind of moved on. The shepherds, I mean, the heavens opened up, a whole bunch of angels showed up, and they started singing and telling them, hey, get to Bethlehem and see the Savior that was been born. That's kind of hard to miss. But the innkeeper, way more subtle, didn't actually realize in the moment what was about to happen, didn't realize everything that he or she was missing. You see, sometimes God speaks into our lives in a more obvious way, a way that is kind of hard to avoid, kind of hard to miss, but there's so often times in life that God knocks on our door, and it's more of the subtle knock. It's perhaps an invitation. Maybe it's more of an interruption. And the question is, how do we respond? Do we invite God to be a part of our lives? Because when Jesus says, listen, I stand at the door and I knock, and if you hear my voice, and if you welcome me in, Jesus says, I will eat with you. Which speaks volumes to the reality of what it is that God is seeking in the midst of our lives. Notice Jesus doesn't say, listen, I'm going to like bang the door down. If you don't answer, I'm coming in anyways. Right? No, he says, I knock on the door. If you hear my voice and you welcome me in, then it's an opportunity for us to respond to what God is wanting to do in our lives. And then notice what Jesus does. He says, I'm going to come in, I'm going to sit you down, and I'm going to start to go over the do's and the don'ts. You've been doing too much of this, don't do that anymore. Do this, do this, this. No, he says, I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to have a meal with you, and we're going to enjoy this together. It, to me, speaks the reality of relationship, of wanting to live all of life with us. This morning, we lit the fourth candle of Advent, the candle of love. And it's here at Christmas that we're reminded, perhaps, of the most well-known verse in the Bible. I mean, this may be the only verse that I have been able to memorize in my mind, but it's John 3:16. It says, for God so loved the world that he gave his son. That he gave his son. And what we begin to see happening is the reality of Scripture, the reality of God's love is that he is knocking upon the doors of our lives. And what he is desiring is that we will be invited in, that he will be invited in, and that we will begin living life with him. Begin to experience that transformation, not simply have the information about God. I think for many of us, we may have all the information about God. Some of it may be misinformation, but have we taken that step and say, yeah, God, I want you to be a part of my life? I know many of you have made that decision, have heard the knock, have welcomed God in, and have begun living life with him. And you, along with me, have experienced that transformation, that reality of holding on to that joy and that hope of experiencing that incredible peace. But maybe there's some of you here this morning that have not taken that step as of yet. And maybe it's this morning here, Christmas Eve, that God is knocking upon your heart and saying, listen, will you welcome me in? Will you make room for me in your life? You see, that only begins to happen when you begin to see yourself in the story. When you begin to see this invitation of Christmas not only having been made 2,000 years ago, but having been made right here today. When Jesus says, I stand at your life, will you welcome me in? Will you allow me to begin to live all of life with you? Now, for many of you here this morning, you may be thinking, well, maybe I'm kind of off the hook here this morning because I've already made that decision. And so I've heard the knock, I responded to the knock, and I want God to be a part of my life. Well, let's just not jump to conclusions too quickly. Because we go back to the innkeeper. And you notice the fact that the innkeeper, he didn't outright reject God's knock on the door. You see, at that point in time, you need to understand, the inn wasn't like the Hilton. Heck, it wasn't even like a Motel 6. It would be more of like a guest house where people would have an extra room, they would have a spare room, and so when people would show up, they would give them their spare room, kind of like a B&B. And then in the back of the house, they would often have a shelter, whether it was cut out of the side of the rock or it was rather rudimentary, but a place where you could then keep your animals. Because nobody really showed up to Bethlehem to go on vacation and to hang out, right? You're kind of on your way through, and so you'd have your animals with you, and so you needed a place for them to stay. And so it's interesting, the innkeeper didn't actually say no to Mary and Joseph. He just didn't give them their best. They kind of allowed limited access to God. Maybe for some of us here this morning, we've heard the knock of God in our life. We have opened the door. But kind of like the innkeeper, we have limited God's access. Think of it this way. Think of your life as a home. I know in my home, I have many rooms, different places you can come, different places you can go. And if you show up at my house and you knock on my door, I will answer the door. And there's a good chance I will welcome you to come in. If you're a visitor, if you're a guest, if you're a friend, you can come into my house. Here's the catch. I will limit your access in my house. You will probably come in and you can hang out in my kitchen. You can hang out in my living room. I will even point you to the nice bathroom that you can use if needed. But listen up. If you show up into my house and I welcome you into my house and I suddenly look down the hall and I notice you going into like my room and then like into the closets and then like into the bathrooms that you're not supposed to, I'd be like, wait a second. You may get uninvited, right? Like just try that here this coming Christmas. You're probably going to be in people's homes, be in people's places. Like, you want to see how much your in-laws actually like you? Go into their bedroom. And then we'll see how quickly Christmas just comes to an end, right? Because you limit your access. Now, there's other people in my life who they don't even knock on the door. They just walk in the front door. They go to the fridge. They hang out in the living room, the dining room, the bedroom. They're in my closet. They're in my bathroom. They're everywhere. They never even really ask for permission. You know who they're called? My kids. Yeah, my kids. They just show up everywhere. But they're family, right? There's a difference. And it's all based upon relationship. Based upon the relationship I have with you is going to determine the access that I'll allow you into my home. Question for us to consider. Is Jesus a guest or is he family? Because there's a lot of times that we may be more like the innkeeper than we think. We may think, the innkeeper, he rejected God completely. No, he didn't. He allowed Mary and Joseph in. He let them on the property. He just didn't give them full access to his life. And sometimes we run into that trap as well, where we begin to compartmentalize our relationship with Jesus. We have certain rooms that, yes, you're more than welcome to come in. Sunday morning is kind of a good room, a good time slot. When I have everything kind of figured out in my life, that's a good room. But there's certain rooms we don't want God to touch, like the room of finance or the room of our messes. Sometimes in life, we have these closets in our lives and the things that we're kind of ashamed about and we don't want others to know, and so we kind of pretend that maybe God won't know either. Or the areas of temptation and struggle. We try to deal with it on our own and we limit God's access. Or in terms of our relationships with others. And what we start to do is we think we're in a full relationship with God, but what we've actually done is limited his access. Not allowed him to have full access into the midst of all of life. And perhaps for some of us this morning, we're not experiencing that abundant life that Jesus offers. We're not experiencing that overwhelming sense of joy and transformation. Perhaps it's because we have limited God's access into our lives. There's an encounter that Jesus had when someone came to him with a question. And it's a question he basically asked Jesus, of all the commandments, of all the laws, what is the most important one that I should follow? Do you know what the person was doing? He was trying to limit God's access. He was wanting to know, what is the most important room that I should let you into my life? And Jesus says, you know what? This is the most important one. Love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. Basically, that's my interpretation of Jesus saying, open up the home. Let me come in. Let me fully live life with you. Christmas is an invitation to live life with God. He knocks on our lives. Sometimes in obvious ways, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes, I have to admit, in ways that I too easily miss. Will we respond? Will we give God full access? I have no way of knowing this, but I wonder if the innkeeper had a sense of regret, a sense of worry of what could have been if I allowed God more access to my life. I don't want that to be a regret for me. And so I desire to take those next steps to see how can I allow God into more of my life so that he does not simply become the person I talk about, the person I sing songs about, but the person I live all of life with. For all of us here this morning, Christmas is God's invitation to live life with him. Will you respond? Will you give him full access? Because when you do, your life will be changed. Your life will be transformed as you begin to experience that hope, that love, that joy, and that peace that can only be found in a relationship with Jesus. Let us pray.